IVM.
Hey everybody, welcome to the IVM Podcast Network. Wow, we're dealing with some stuff, aren't we? The COVID-19 scare we're facing in India and the world has, it's really changed our lives, hasn't it? But it's also seriously impacted our ability to create podcasts and to get them out to you on schedule. Over the next few weeks, I'd like to ask for your patience if episodes are delayed or postponed. We're also going to be doing many of the recordings remotely, like this one, for example, right? And sound quality is going to be a little uneven while we're facing this time, right? If you want to listen to discussions about COVID, we have had conversations on Cider Says, the Pragati Podcast, Thale Arate, All Things Policy, The Rapid Coach, and other shows as well, right? So, please do continue to stay tuned, and we will be talking about this stuff, and we'll be talking about life in general. Also want to thank our sponsors this week, HDFC Life and Paytm Money. So let's get on with this, and I hope you enjoyed this episode.
How does an infectious disease spread across a human society? We say that we live in a global village where you can reach anyone in the world in just 6 degrees. Is this how a pandemic like COVID-19 spreading across the world? How do researchers model the spread of an epidemic? How do you even model a human society first? As gaseous molecules, as hubs and spokes on a network, as agents with their own behavior? Dr. Srini Venkatraman joins us on today's episode of the Pragati Podcast to talk to us about the science of infectious disease modeling at a time when it has never been more important. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Dr. Srini Venkatraman is a research scientist at the Biocomplexity Institute at the University of Virginia. Hailing from Chennai, Srini completed his PhD in electrical engineering from IISc in Bangalore, and at the Biocomplexity Institute he uses mathematical and computational models of human societies to study the spread of infectious diseases and ways to control them. We'll start our conversation with Srini after a short break.
Hi, I'm Sarayu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasannakumar.
And we are the hosts of the Ganatantra Podcast.
On this podcast, we speak to academics, social scientists, journalists, and activists to find out what's actually going on in Indian politics.
On this podcast, we stay away from personality politics, intrigue, and gossip, and instead focus on the data, research, and analysis that drives all this.
So tune in to the Ganatantra Podcast, where new episodes are out every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Srini, welcome to the show.
Hi, Pavan. Glad to do this podcast with you guys.
We are here to talk about what you do day in and day out, epidemiological modeling, right? And this is something I think very far removed from a lot of public discussions, but suddenly in the time of COVID-19, everyone is talking about how this is a pandemic, how this is spreading, how we need to flatten the curve and use social distancing. And there's a lot of conversation that's happening, right? Unfortunately, I feel like this conversation is happening in a vacuum where people don't have too much understanding and exposure to how diseases and the spread of infectious diseases get modeled. And this is a science that is quite esoteric and quite far removed from the public knowledge of most of us. In fact, I might dare to say that I think India has far fewer epidemiologists and public health professionals compared to even the doctors and the medical professionals that we have. So it's great that you're joining us to break this down, take 10, maybe 20 steps back and get a real sense and a handle on how to think about diseases, how they spread, and how scholars and researchers like you are working on this. My first idea and where I wanted to start today was that we have a long history of people who've always wanted to understand how diseases work, right? So if even Imhotep in ancient Egypt describes cancer, we have Hippocrates talking about the 4 humors and how imbalance in the humors sort of explains various kinds of ailments and diseases. So in that sense, there's been that evolution from there all the way to germ theory as to how diseases and infections form and how they work. And some of this does trickle down into public imagination and memory. Like, for example, a lot of people have talked about Jon Snow, not the guy from Game of Thrones, but the English physician who did some fantastic work with cholera, I think 150 years ago or so, right? 170 now, where he managed to track it in London to its source of origin. But could you give us a sense of when did mathematics and modeling come into this? Because if something is going to go exponentially and spread, we need to be able to figure out how this entire beast works, right? So could you give us a sense of how your field evolved and started?
Sure. And I'll start with a disclaimer. This is a science that has evolved over, I would say, a century roughly now. And again, like traces back to like early efforts by Jon Snow and folks like Ronald Ross. And I can walk through the history. And as for my background, again, I'm not a medical doctor. My training is in actually stochastic modeling and network modeling in electrical engineering, understanding communication networks. And I did my PhD out of Indian Institute of Science. And now I'm working with University of Virginia. So going back to this question of how diseases spread, maybe we can start from the same example that you said about Jon Snow. Mm-hmm. What he did was an early idea of tracing the source of an infection by using what we now call like GIS skills, using geospatial information to narrow down source of infection. So if you just take, I think nowadays there are so many maps out there which show where COVID-19 is spreading or how many cases are there in different countries. So what he looked at that time was cholera outbreak. I think it was in 1854. And he looked at the different districts and different places where like death rates due to cholera was very high. And he mapped them on a region and then looked at where they originate out of. And he traced them back to like well or like water sources that were feeding these different communities. And this again is a period where there was kind of like different theories circulating about like how diseases spread in general, like the germ theory versus miasma theory. As you pointed out, like this is a science that's evolved as more data and more information and more biological insights have been derived over the past century.
Right. And back in the day, in 1854, I think there was a lot of public opposition to the idea that cholera can come from, fecal contamination of water, right? I think there was almost moral outrage. And if I'm not mistaken, Jon Snow got a lot of flack for his claims as well. But I think eventually people came around to the idea that no, he was correct. And they started thinking more seriously about how do you separate your water sources from sanitation and contamination. And that's honestly a challenge we still face in India and many parts of the world today. But that was a big moment in science and our thinking 150, 170 years ago.
Exactly. So like a lot of times when science makes, this is almost like a discovery of process that's already unfolding. And through that, we get some realizations that some things need to change or some things are causing unintended outcomes. And that's when we have to seriously introspect and then figure out alternative ways of doing the same thing. We don't want to completely upend cultures or upend civilizations. But as we know more about some things, we need to evolve our understanding and the way we operate. And that's what happens in each stage of development. And I think like epidemiology has also gone through that over several decades, I would say. Like even now we are seeing a lot of oppositions to the way our countries or even societies are handling this. And this is something that is not something that we can do day in and day out. Just like handling hurricanes or storms and cyclones, you need to refine your policies by learning from your mistakes. And every time you try something, there might be some science backing it, but also science learns from the mistakes that you make. And then the next time you're better prepared. In India, like the Odisha cyclone that killed a lot of people, and then like we were able to figure out how to learn from those mistakes and then reduce fatalities by creating early warning systems. And those kind of things are happening when it comes to epidemiology, but it is a much more complicated science and it's still in its infancy, I would say.
Okay. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the super cyclones that were devastating the coast of Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, and so on had fatalities in the tens of thousands, if not much, much higher, right? And today, even with large cyclones hitting the coast, people have figured out how to evacuate, how to get to shelter, such that while there is still a lot of property damage, the loss of lives have been dramatically reduced. I'm sure we have a long way to go still, but can see the dramatic difference probably just in the last 20 years. My personal hope from everything that's going to happen with COVID-19 is that after this, we can maybe work towards having COVID-19 be the last of its kind, right? That we will never allow another such thing to become the pandemic, a full-blown pandemic. So that's the hope. But coming back, when we look at Jon Snow and what they did, and later you had Louis Pasteur working on vaccines, you had this moment where it feels like detective work, right? Where did this start? Where did this go? And a lot of work, like you said, about old school GIS mapping and so on. From that to coming to a place where we come up with a mathematical model of how this disease works and being able to model and simulate something. How long did that sort of process take?
It traces back to late 19th century and early 20th century. Sir Ronald Ross, who actually received his Nobel Prize and somewhere around 1904 for his work on malaria. He was one of the early proponents of mathematical modeling, and he defined some of these early classes of models which look like SIR models, which we can go into slightly some more detail. And he showed that by reducing the mosquito population under a threshold, you can control the spread of the disease. That was one of the early work of showing the impact of mathematical modeling. And in fact, if you go back, there are some early instances of just using probabilistic model for understanding disease spread, I think all the way going back to Bernoulli.
Okay.
But the current class of models, you can trace it from late 19th century. And then 1927 is this landmark paper by Kermack and McKendrick. This is what is classically called as the SIR model.
Okay.
And that's roughly 93 years ago. That paper, this is a era where we were looking at societies. I mean, even though we understand how social networks evolve, initial approximation that people start making is, let's assume they are like particles. Even though we are not particles, we have free will and we move around and we have very heterogeneous networks among us. What they assume is, let's start with a simpler assumption where let's take a city like Bangalore and then assume that there are, say, 10 million people. I don't know the exact population right now, but
10, 12 million people now.
So let's take the population of Bangalore and then let's assume that everyone meets everyone. That's a very simplistic assumption. But if under that assumption, let's assume that, say, 1% of them or even 100 of them are infected with some disease. Okay. And that would be the class of people who we call as infectious or infected folks.
Okay.
And the others are mostly susceptible.
Right.
So this SIR of the model is population is mostly susceptible in the class S.
Okay.
And then there is a small fraction of folks who are in the infected state, the I state, and then there's no one in the recovered state yet.
Okay.
What they start doing is, let's take the infected folks, and usually each of these diseases have a duration for which you are infected or infectious. Say for fever or a common cold or flu, it's roughly in the ballpark of 4 to 5 days. And so you can assume that during that time frame, whoever they come in contact with can get exposed to this virus, or in this case, they can get infected.
Okay.
This contact is again mediated by just particle mixing kind of a framework, which is almost physics, where you have a big box and a lot of billiard balls kind of a model.
So all the complexity of sort of human interaction, the first approximation of this is sort of particles in Brownian motion, right? Randomly colliding into each other at different speeds and different rates.
Yes. Even simplifying, you just have a global parameter of a mixing rate, which controls the velocity of all these particles.
Okay.
But beyond that, you just have the population size and you know what is the number of people or fraction of people in each of these S, I, and R states.
Okay.
So you can write down what you've studied in high school called differential equations, which just describe at each time step how many new susceptibles will move from susceptible to infected state.
Okay.
Just because of bumping into infected folks. Just if you think in terms of simple round numbers, if you have 100 folks, of which 10 are infected, there are 90 of them who are not infected. And therefore, if you look at average number of people who are going to get in contact, it will be proportional to 90 times 10.
Okay.
Because there are 90 people who are susceptible, 10 people who are infected. And so the rate at which susceptible people will become infected is somewhat proportional to 90 times 10, because that's the number of contacts through which disease can spread. And you can see that this will keep increasing until some point as the infected set grows. Mm-hmm. And the susceptible set is still not shrunk by much, because if you take a population like Bangalore, you have a 10 million population with just 100 infected. In the early case, it would be 100 times 10 million minus 100. That's still a small number because you're multiplying it with 100. But then once it gets to 10,000, and there will be a point at which it will be maximum, this kind of a rate of growth.
Okay.
And then after that, the natural property of the system is that after some point, the number of susceptibles that are still in the population starts reducing, because that's where the R component of the model comes in, where like infected people don't stay infected for long. They either die or they recover. And that's why like R is they call it removed as a very euphemistic term. So they're technically removed from the population. Either they're recovered, so they're completely immune to the disease, or they're dead and therefore they're no longer circulating the disease out there. And therefore that population will start growing as people move through the infectious state. And eventually what you get is the population that is still susceptible is shrinking, and that kind of is the upper bar of like how many people can get infected. So usually what you see is like, this is a very simplistic model, but it can capture some really nice properties, because if you have a disease, like for instance, say Ebola, which is very highly infectious, but you need to have very strong contact, like social contacts need to be very close contacts, it's bodily fluids, whereas it also has a higher fatality rate.
Right.
So if you take such a disease, it will burn itself out very quickly, because by the time a person infects another person, this is where another concept of this model comes in, where how quickly it grows depends on how infectious the disease is, but also how long a person can stay infectious.
I've been hearing talk a lot in COVID. One of the numbers that's thrown around a lot is this R0 or R0, right? Is that linked to what you're saying about the infectiousness of a disease?
Yes, exactly. That's what I was coming to. Basically, if you look at some diseases, if you look at R0, and again, this is one class of models that started in 1927, and almost simultaneously, there's another one that I want to bring up, because both of these models have informed epidemiological advances over the past century. So the other one is called the Reed-Frost model, where instead of looking at particles bouncing against each other, we're looking at what they call like branching processes, or like just 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, and so on. Like you have, and it's a nice analogy to how forest fires spread, or like how diseases spread, where if it's each person infects 2 other people, then by the time, like if you have 10 steps, you would have 1024 if all of them have like 2 different contacts that they're infecting. And these are used for just understanding how population just grows. Like demographic models also use similar branching processes. But then, like, that's where this concept of R0 comes in both these classes of models. Because what you're asking is, if you have a completely susceptible population and you put 1 infected person in that population, then how many new infections happen by the time the first infected person recovers? So this is a number which says if you can infect as many people as you want, until you recover, and as many people constrained by your contact network or like the mixing assumptions, then you're asking how many infections on average occur in that duration of your infectiousness. And if that's very high, then the disease would spread much rapidly, because by the time you recover or die, you would have spread the disease to a lot of folks. And this R0 is a very coarse estimate, because it depends on how the population is structured.
Right.
And it depends on, some of it is dependent on the biology of the disease itself, but it relates to the social contact structure or like the susceptibility of the population and so on. And it's a good indicator though, like, because if it's less than 1, a disease will not sustain itself. Because if 1 person on average infects fewer than 1 people, then it won't spread. Basically, it won't multiply.
Right.
It won't have that exponential growth. But if it's greater than 1, you usually have something that needs to be controlled. And like if you look at something like seasonal flu, they usually put it around 1.4, 1.5. And things like measles, I would say it's much higher. They estimate it anywhere from 12 to 18, which is very high. Whereas for polio or smallpox, polio is like 5 to 7, smallpox is anywhere between 3.5 and 6, and SARS was again like 2 to 5. Whereas if you look at influenza, estimates range from 1.4 to 2.8, but like usually seasonal influenza is roughly in the lower ballpark of that. So this kind of gives you a good idea of how rapidly things can evolve. And all of these will look like exponentials. It's just that the rate at which the exponential grows in the early phase is to some extent driven by that R0 number. So that's the class of models that people started with.
Wow. Okay. Before we get to newer models, what is the R0 number that's being estimated for COVID-19? I'm hearing numbers like 2.3, 2.5 and so on. Are they accurate? I'm sure these are also very contextual, right? So if there is a place in which people are more densely packed, for example, like say just India compared to a much less densely populated country, the R0s might be different and so on, right? So there is no universal number, but
yes,
it's context specific.
It is very context specific. And so So right now, the estimates range anywhere from 1.4. Some people go all the way up to like 3.5, 3.9. 3.9 is the estimate that I'm looking at. Like, I would say right now, it's very context dependent. I mean, it's greater than 1. It's something that needs to be controlled. And right now, the best estimates range around 2.3, 2.5, as you said.
Okay.
And more importantly, what we start focusing on is the effective R, or like the effective reproductive number, which is less talked about, but that's basically what is under our control in some sense.
Okay.
As the population starts experiencing the disease, as I said, like the rate at which the disease burns through the susceptible population, to use a forest fire analogy, you would see that fewer and fewer infections can be created by an infected person. And that's one aspect that drives down the R effective. Instead of R naught, the zero in R naught is basically at time zero, with him being patient zero, almost. Like, you can think of it that way. And beyond that, anything that you're looking at is something like R effective. The other thing that can bring down R naught is as people start socially distancing or start hand washing practices, and basically anything that reduces the chances of disease spreading will bring down the effective R. The whole goal of this control, what they're calling flattening the curve, is basically bringing down that R effective. How long can you bring it down? How well can you bring it down across different populations, as you said? That basically determines how well we can control such a disease.
Okay. Thank you for explaining and really unpacking that. The other takeaway for me was when we look at the work of John Snow and some of the other earlier people who are working on infectious diseases, sort of the mathematical tool that was being used, or the field that was being used, was largely statistics, right? So it feels like with the introduction of these models, suddenly we bring in differential equations into trying to solve infectious disease issues. What I find fascinating is how field after field sort of comes in, and the interdisciplinary nature of science is not something that is new, but from the very beginning. To me, there is a logical extension between differential equations playing a role in disease modeling 100 years ago to conversation today with you, where you're an electrical engineer by training who's working on disease modeling today. It seems like a very natural extension of what happened 100 years ago. Would you agree with that?
Exactly. This is something that we see across domains, because every time a new discipline is introduced to a particular domain, and I'm using these terms kind of vaguely, but like if you look at how we train students and in our traditional departments, we kind of compartmentalize them, to use a epidemiological term. We put them in different departments and then train them for specific toolkits. We say that you shouldn't be reading computational fluid dynamics. Why would you need that? And why would you need differential equations? Why would you need graph theory? And the thing is, what we've seen in especially these computational sciences, looking at social systems and understanding how they're evolving and how you control them or how you optimize some of these, you're seeing every time a new discipline is introduced, you get an influx of new ideas. And sometimes there's a nice confluence of ideas, because like it's not that they'll completely replace existing schools of thoughts, but you would see the emergence of like ideas that would not have emerged because of individual disciplines. Like they have to cross-pollinate in some sense.
So in a sense, what you're recommending is, when it comes to academia, social distancing is a terrible idea, but when it comes to pandemic, social distancing is a fantastic idea.
Yeah. In fact, like I would say, if anything, good ideas needs to flow without borders, national borders, international borders, or even academic discipline borders. Speaking in the same way, like bad information or misinformation should be curtailed at each step. So that way, like we allow good ideas to mix and come with very novel, unique solutions. So there are a lot of things that we didn't have in 1918, but just like we have a lot of tools at our disposal, we have a lot of challenges too. Like the disease would not have spread this rapidly in 1918 because of the connectivity. And second thing, the idea of controlling misinformation through social media is not something that there would still have been misinformation and rumors in newspapers, because we were all in echo chambers. In 1918, like there were echo chambers naturally induced by staying in different locations. But right now, that's a bigger challenge that we see.
So in that sense, if you're looking at that compartment, the Brownian motion speed has increased, right, across the world.
Exactly.
It's not like different little compartments and we're all much more connected. But one thing I want to ask you is, this is 100-year-old science and modeling. Does this still have value today? Do these first approximation compartment-based models, are they still in vogue? Say, for example, with COVID-19, Are scholars using compartment models and modified versions of those to try and simulate how the disease might spread?
Yes and no. Some of the ideas that we have for like these public health interventions have their roots in these kind of modeling approaches. We know intuitively that these should work, but having a mathematical model justify that what you're doing is the right direction to think is also reassuring. For instance, if you know that like both mathematically and practically you understand that something is going to happen and doing this would help, it is always a reassuring thing and it redoubles your confidence in your work. For instance, like if you look at the different things that people do to stop these kind of epidemics, the first is you want to reduce the duration someone stays infectious because it brings down the R0. How can you do that? You either treat them and then the person does not stay infectious for long, but they get cured faster.
Okay.
Or you isolate them, basically ask them to stay at home or ask them to come to a hospital where they're separated from the general population. And both of these critically depend on testing them and finding that they're infectious.
Right.
So that's a key principle that comes out of this model. And the second thing is you reduce the general contact rate for a disease like COVID-19. Since you don't know who is infectious and who's not for some population, you don't know the people who are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic and still aiding transmission. So the only way to control that is taking this Brownian motion approach is reduce the rate at which the balls are moving, bumping into each other. That's the general principle behind social distancing. And the third thing is, this is not something that we can hope for in the short term, but usually the way diseases get controlled is down the line, you have vaccines coming in. And like, for instance, if you go back to H1N1, it did have something like this in the spring in 2009. It did have a small spring wave, and then it came back with a much stronger wave during fall. And at that time, we were already prepared. And since it was another influenza strain, we had mechanisms to prepare influenza vaccines, which are targeted at H1N1. By the time October or November, they were able to roll out those vaccines and control the spread reasonably well. So that's the other thing that you can get. Like vaccines help because you reduce the number of susceptible people by making them immune without having to get the disease. And finally, just by reducing transmissibility from an infected person by asking them to wash their hands and practice hygienic habits, then you ensure that they don't transmit the disease that well, like coughing into your elbows or wearing masks. All of these are ways of reducing the chance of infecting another susceptible. You can see that this model, even though in its very simplistic form, it has knobs which can control each of these variables and you derive these insights.
Wow, that is so powerful for something that is so simple. Differential equations are hard things for most of us who are not in the business of solving differential equations. But it's amazing that this is the kind of analytical power and the power of generating insights of such a simplified model of how the world is. And that's just amazing to hear. We'll be back with Srini after a short break.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कुटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Welcome back. I'm Pavan Srinath and you're listening to Srini Venkatraman on how the spread of infectious diseases can be modeled.
The next natural discipline that comes in from mathematics that helps understanding this, you can trace it back to even Reed Frost, like the branching process is an early version of this, like the graph theory or what we now call in a fashionable way, network science.
Right.
So this is understanding any system as a collection of entities and their interactions.
Okay.
So you connect entities like individuals through edges, and then you look at anything. We live on a social network. We use transportation networks, road networks, power grid networks. All of these can be all the way down to protein interaction networks and genome networks inside our body. You can build networks of entities.
Okay.
And then you can ask the same question, because like if a disease spreads in a network, then you can say, remove these edges and and remove these nodes. And when you say remove, you basically say vaccinate these guys or make sure that all the school contacts are removed by closing schools. And that's the next evolution that you see in these kind of models. And there is a nice intermediate of these two approaches, which is one which assumes everyone's mixing with everyone. That's the differential equation kind of approaches.
Right.
And then the other extreme, you have every individual has a set of contacts. They have school contacts and work contacts. And there's something in between also where you can say like, you can model a community as a node. Like rather than modeling every individual, you say like, let's model Bangalore as a node. Like, let's not worry about Bangalore beyond. Like, let's just say like there are 12 million people in Bangalore.
Right.
And we care about Bangalore as a whole. And inside Bangalore, everyone mixes with everyone, but they don't mix with people in Chennai that frequently as mixing with people in Bangalore. So there is a distance associated with it, and also the rate at which they mix with different communities changes by distance and connection level. So you have a network of ODs. This is a very interesting confluence of ideas from two different disciplines. And this is something that actually ecologists were studying.
Okay.
Way back in like early 20th century, they called it a meta-population model, which basically says it's a population of populations.
Okay.
So you actually collect several populations and then put them as individual nodes. And then you say like, this is the interpopulation mixing and this is the intra-population mixing.
Okay.
And then you say like, let's let the disease spread in this kind of a setup. So that is somewhere in between in terms of complexity. And it can capture some of these aspects. And then what I was describing earlier, where you model each person separately and then model their contact networks and their school or work and all of these. These are what are in the class of agent-based models.
Okay.
They're individual level models, and they are very useful for some of these questions that pertain to interventions.
Srini, one of the things I've come across recently, a few friends have been talking about it, others, there's this small world network. If I'm not mistaken, it's something that has been used in some of the research you and your colleagues at the Biocomplexity Institute have also used. Could you give me a sense of what the small world network is? Am I getting the term right?
Yes, this is what I was hinting at when I said network science. Seminal papers around network science came in 1998. So we are roughly 22 years into the advent of network science. And it looks at networks as a first-class object. So instead of looking at communication networks and electrical networks and social networks, all of them as separately, we just characterize them as nodes and edges. Then look at what are all the common properties across all these kind of nets. Say, if you look at an electrical network and you see a surge in a transformer and then it cascades through that network, like if there is an overload and then one of them shuts down, then another part of the grid needs to support that network and maybe it cannot handle it and it will shut down. And if you just look at it in a very abstract sense, this is no different from a computer virus spreading,
right,
or a rumor spreading in Facebook by sharing and liking and retweeting, or disease spreading among people.
Okay.
In a very coarse sense. So when you just abstract it out, they're just entities which are spreading things on contacts and edges. And this is also contributed because of like the availability of data, because we had a lot of these data sets coming online. And then when you look at them, some of these have like very similar properties. So one of the things that you mentioned called small world, this is something that is also called like sometimes in social networks as 6 degrees of separation.
Okay.
In a very technical terminology, what we call it is the diameter of the graph is very small.
Okay.
So it's easy to think of a diameter for a circle, but like what does it mean to call a diameter of a graph? Basically what you're saying is, what is the diameter of a circle? It's the farthest distance from one end of a circle to the other.
Right.
In the same way, on a graph, if you look at the distances, the shortest paths from any person to another person, and then look at the largest value for that. So how many hops do I have to make from one person to another person, and then look at the longest such shortest path.
Okay.
That's the way to define a diameter of a graph. And what they say is this is kind of percolated into even our normal language, where we say it's a small world because you meet someone and you get to know that he worked with someone that you went to school with, or with just 5 hops, you can get a letter forwarded to the Prime Minister of India or the President of US. And you would be surprised that like person you know knows a person, knows a person, knows a person, knows that person. This small world phenomenon is observed in a lot of these networks, and it is something that contributes to this disease spreading very quickly. So you might think that like you're fairly well separated from someone in Wuhan. I don't know anyone in Wuhan, but maybe one of your friends goes to class with someone in Wuhan and you don't know. And maybe folks who go to Wuhan for medical college. And it's not just Wuhan. Like, take any region. It's very tough for us to comprehend some of these global properties of networks. We think very locally. We know our local contact networks, whereas the small world properties make disease spread very easy. There are very similar concepts like something called scale freeness of the network, which is what you see is some people have very huge degree.
Okay.
And most people have smaller degrees. And what happens is when the disease hits one of these high degree nodes, then they create these super spreader events. And that's another thing that's concerning because you would want these people to be sufficiently protected, but they're the ones who have a lot of contact. So they're already more likely to get the disease. Where if they get the disease, they expose a lot of other contacts. Like for instance, in New York City, I think patient 0 was an attorney and they found a lot of cases around his cluster. These kind of things are natural properties of social networks, and understanding them from a very craft theoretical sense allows us to get an idea of what we are dealing with rather than making this assumption that, okay, we are geographically separated, so we shouldn't be worrying too much. It's happening somewhere in the north, happening somewhere else in the world. We shouldn't be that worried. We should be thinking more in terms of there are things that we don't understand, but it is property of a graph. Same way, like we don't understand exponential growth, we don't understand small worldness of a graph. That's what these kind of diseases reveal to us.
Wow. This is so interesting. You even use the word super spreader. So even this idea, so when you're looking at these old compartment models where you have this Brownian motion kind of thing, people mixing, the assumption by and large is that everyone moves at similar rates or on some distribution of speeds, right? And the network theory and the small world network comes from a very different place and says, hey, there might be some people who might have more connections and therefore could spread certain diseases more, either over geography or within a locality. There might be some certain others with fewer connections and so on. So even this idea of sort of differentiation among different people based on their behavior, their position, their station in life, and their whether they're traveling or not, all also influences how the epidemic or the disease can spread. So that seems to be one takeaway that I had immediately from the discussion that we just had just now.
Exactly. The other aspect that we are ignoring is right now there are two steps that we have to take. First, in this Brownian motion kind of world, everyone meets everyone, so it's a homogeneous mixing and homogeneous individuals.
Right.
And then the next step that you can take is it's heterogeneous mixing in the sense that people have different networks and different local contacts, but you can still start with everyone is alike kind of an assumption. All of these nodes are the same.
Right.
Except for their network spread, they're all equally susceptible.
Okay.
They're all equally likely to spread and so on. What you're actually dealing with is something where like the nodes also have attributes, because some of these are older people, some of these are immunocompromised folks, and some of these people, they're vaccinated or not. And a lot of these attributes change how the disease spreads. And that's the level of detail that we would need. That's when we are starting to think in terms of these agent-based models where like each agent has a set of attributes and a set of activities, and they come in contact with people, and you build these social contact networks which are heterogeneous. So you're essentially reaching this point where you're completely representing the society, whatever is relevant. You're not representing every single phone booth or every single fire extinguisher in it. You're just looking at what is relevant to this kind of question, and you're representing the population in our in silico representation.
And they seem to be better and better approximations of the real world.
Exactly. And that's where what you would need is having access to data. You would need to parameterize these models in such a way that you capture this diversity. You can throw in any number of assumptions into it, but the model will be better if you use better data sets. These days, like with the availability of smartphones and looking at a lot of these digital representations of like road networks or even like satellite imagery, looking at where work locations are, where residences are, and you can build better and better representations of the real world. You will never exactly match the real world, and that's not the goal.
Right.
The goal is to actually simulate it in a reasonably good fidelity. So in some sense, what we're trying to do is there won't be an exact equivalent to Pavan in the simulation, but what we would have is someone that might match your demographic attributes, or in an aggregate sense, the statistical properties of population is captured. Like 50% of them would be male, and the age distributions would match, the school sizes would match, household sizes would match, and so on. These are the numbers that we can get from census. And other than that, we impose some model constraints, and we look at a lot of literature on how far do people travel for work and how many classes are there in this particular school and what are the different class sizes. And using that, we can represent in a better sense a particular city.
So basically, the more complex the model, from old compartmental models to network models to full-on agent-based simulations, we need much, much larger sets of data to be able to use them to make these models work well, right? But I have one question. What you talked me earlier about the compartment models and how various things can affect your effective R or the transmission rate or R naught seem now like lessons that can be learned about infectious diseases from all the modeling that has happened so far. So from what you mentioned about social distancing, about hygiene and hand washing, about isolation and quarantine, all of these now feel like received wisdom from years, if not decades and decades of simulations. So the question becomes, what can we learn from a new simulation? For example, with say COVID-19 coming in, if we know that this is a droplet-borne infection that spreads through coughing, sneezing, and through contact and so on, and if all of these general principles are something that we know that already makes sense, then what would a high-quality model of COVID-19, what new insights would this give? Beyond these lessons, which we now should make it a part of our lives, unfortunately we have not. How do we get more specific, actionable insights on specific epidemics and spread of diseases through more and better models?
I would say the answer is twofold. One is the disease is different. We've done a lot of influenza modeling, and the thing that people keep saying is every influenza season is a different season.
Okay.
Unless we drive it into our head, like we can't approach it the same way because there is something slightly different about the strain or something slightly different about the weather or about which age groups are impacted or the efficacy of the vaccine that changes at a macro level how the season evolves. And the same way, like you can say like, yes, COVID-19 is another respiratory illness. It is coronavirus along the same lines of SARS and MERS, and it generally falls in similar symptom class as like influenza and even common cold. So maybe all the simulations that we've done for like influenza should be good enough to learn these lessons. In fact, that's where we start from. But first thing that changes is for a disease, it has some unique properties. Like for instance, in COVID-19, this pre-symptomatic phase seems to be causing a lot more infections. And this is not that common in influenza at least. So you either show symptoms or not. And then when you don't show symptoms, you are less infectious in general. And there are good estimates for that. Whereas for something like COVID-19, the biggest challenge has been knowing how many cases you're not seeing.
Right.
So the disease brings some nuances to the simulation. When you assume some particular detection rate and you assume some rate of pre-symptomatic of the people who get exposed to the virus, how many of them are pre-symptomatic and how infectious they are. And these are numbers which are very tough to understand or like even estimate unless you go out there and sample every person in the population. But like some countries are coming up with like reasonable estimates of it. And so that's one thing that will change. So we have to rerun some of the simulations. And the second thing I would say, the society is different. Every single day as data comes in and the way people respond differently, both at the micro and macro level, like for the first time, like at least in our lifetimes, we have not seen like countries shutting themselves completely down. Like when China did it, they said like it was mostly authoritarian policies, which will not be replicable in Western countries. And now you're hearing about Italy and France and Spain, Bolivia now cancelling its national elections, postponing them. And you can see that like this disease requires that level of control. So which means that you need to also incorporate data sets, like either qualitative or quantitative data on like how people are moving, how people are responding, and what is the impact of all these lockdowns on social distance or just the mixing rates. And so a simulation needs to be very adaptive. It needs to incorporate current situations rather than taking a simulation off the shelf and then just saying you would get this many people infected. That's the first answer that we'll give because we don't have any other data.
Right.
But you might have to adapt it.
Okay. So at one level, the basic question is how big might this problem become itself is a very important policy question because that then determines how much mind space should it occupy of policymakers, how severe and how intense should be the response and so on, right? Just to start on size and the spread and the fatality itself can drive prioritization among governments and among people who have decision-making authority. One other thing I'm curious about is how someone who's tried to look at things like weather forecasting and climate forecasting in the past and see how that works. And we see that those forecasts work very, very differently at different time scales, right? So we can do some broad simulations, massive global simulations of how the world might evolve in 100 years if emission levels are as high as they are. And there are people who have charted different scenarios of what would happen if, say, we take more sustainable development strategies versus, business as usual and so on. I see that at one level. We have seen these large physical model simulations of the weather, which are used for forecasting, say, whether will it rain tomorrow? Is the monsoon going to be okay this year? Is there going to be a super cyclone or something like Hurricane Sandy that's going to hit? So you have different kinds of simulations that exist in that world, and I'm sure economists have a bunch of models on how much an economy will grow. Could you give us a flavor of how epidemiological modeling could be similar and very different from all of that, both in terms of how fundamentally they work, as well as the kind of insights one can derive from them?
I'm glad that you brought up the weather analogy because there's a lot of similarity between weather and epidemic modeling when it comes to both forecasting or projections and also how people respond in the case of extreme weather events or, like in this case, a pandemic. So if you look at the commonalities, the first thing is being able to ingest data on the current conditions, either through different sensors placed across the world, looking at all the weather variables like temperature, rainfall, and then feeding them into a simulation and running them forward for short-term projections, or incorporating all of this and then taking some physics models and generally looking at global temperature rise and looking at carbon emission and incorporating them into the models. So there are similarities in this. What is different is this is something that's worth stressing because weather forecasting has evolved over the past 50, 60 years into a science that people can depend on. In some sense, people make decisions when they say that there is going to be a cyclone coming and all these people on this coast need to evacuate by 5 p.m. because we expect it to make a landfall at 7:30, then people trust it. And people make their plans exactly according to that. They evacuate, they follow the routes, they evacuate. And the same way, we make even short-term decisions. If it says that chances of rain tomorrow are 60%, you might need an umbrella. You do make decisions which are very mundane, but you make them based on weather predictions. Whereas when you look at epidemic science, it's in its infancy because the same capabilities are there, in some sense, trying to make long-term and short-term. But what is lacking is an understanding of how to incorporate all of this into this notion of people changing behavior. Because when you look at weather predictions, if you say that it's going to rain based on all these phenomenological models and then chance of rain is 70%, doesn't depend on how many people carry their umbrella. So it will rain. If you say 70% rain, there's 30% chance that it won't rain. And if it doesn't rain, you would still carry your umbrella and you will be like, okay, they said 70% chance, but it didn't rain. We always joke about this in Chennai that like this person who comes from like the meteorological service, he said that it would rain, so I don't need an umbrella tomorrow because it will surely not rain. But then like we do take them seriously and knowing that like our behavior does not change the forecast. Whereas if you look at epidemic predictions, they make these predictions under very specific assumptions of behavior.
Right.
When people incorporate these predictions into their mental models and they change their behavior in a local scale or in a global scale, if suddenly people change their behavior in a sense, then the predictions are no longer valid because you predicted them based on how people are mixed. Already you see that there is a lot more complexity. You're not actually modeling every single molecule of air on the planet to make weather predictions, but you're trying to get closer and closer by sampling enough sensors. Whereas here, we don't have that much sensing capability yet, what they call like sentinel surveillance,
right?
Knowing where infections are growing and just collecting all this data from different hospitals. I did listen to this podcast that you sent interviewing a physician in Bangalore, and you can see how the data from individual clinics should percolate all the way up to something like a national surveillance center where they can look at what is the level of hospital visits that are influenza-like symptoms across the country. And only then you get a sense of, okay, is this more along the lines of what we've seen in past years for this month, or is it off the charts and is picking up in some of these different regions where we think COVID-19 circulation is also there? Those kind of questions, how to factor them in, along with this notion that people might change their behavior, makes it very challenging to make projections. That said, the questions still remain. Short-term projections and long-term projections, people tend to make them because that is what will drive policy.
Right.
We still have to make these numbers.
I'm sure it's at least one order of magnitude better, but like how economic forecasting works, right? If somebody is going to say, India is going to be growing at 8% per annum 7 years from now, we have no idea if that is true or not, right? Because you can build a model and estimate it, but we have no idea about the kind of changes that can take place in the Indian economy and Indian politics, such that prediction at that scale starts making very little sense. But at the same time, it is something that is desired, because you want to set a target that is, say, 20 years from now for you to achieve certain things and so on. So there is a demand, and sometimes there is a supply of those kinds of projections, but I'm guessing that they do come with significant riders and caveats and ranges in the possible futures. So in this, I wanted to follow up. So now you've studied influenza, the seasonal flu extensively. Your colleagues have also done a lot of fantastic work on that. So before we finally get to COVID, where a lot of it is still in the air, and my aim with this episode is to get a sense of how this works rather than necessarily give very concrete answers for how COVID-19 is working as an epidemic or a pandemic. I was particularly fascinated by your paper about how do you allocate things like vaccines when there's scarce resources, and say the seasonal flu is broken out in a bunch of places, which feels like a very, very, very important and interesting resource allocation question. And a lot of the times governments are asking resource allocation questions. I have a budget of 100 rupees. Where do I put this money to get the maximum sort of public benefit? And could you share your example of what kind of insights you could draw from your study and how you even went about it?
Sure. This was a study that was done in collaboration with folks at the Biocomplexity Institute. And we've been looking at these questions. So what we call it like data-driven decision making, trying to build these models to aid policymakers to make impactful decisions. So for this particular vaccine allocation study that we did, the question that we asked was, this is looking at US seasonal influenza. And usually it has a very clear spatial pattern. Just look at the surveillance data. It starts in the southeast and then it kind of radiates out almost in a concentric fashion. And then around February, March timeframe, it again stops having it's almost like this how spring emerges in different regions.
Okay.
There are a lot of ways in which weather also impacts this. So since there is a very clear spatial aspect to this, we also see that in several countries, in temperate countries, especially where there's a lot of weather variation across the country. And the question was, if you had limited vaccines, and vaccine is also produced in a particular distribution cycle. So it's not like you have 300 million vaccines on day zero go, because there is a production rate. And usually by September, October timeframe, when vaccines are being rolled out, you have enough supply to catch up. But it also is a question of where do you ramp up these advertisements or asking people to take vaccines. And if you have limited resources of any kind, if you want to send some people to set up flu shot clinics in different places, these are also limited resources. And as you said, resource allocation is always a question everything comes down to. So you're always asking questions of optimization and doing better than what you currently are. And what our model did was we built a model of how seasonal flu spreads within United States. And we used this class of models that I was talking about, which is a meta population. We didn't model every individual in the US.
Okay.
We modeled counties, and we connected them using commuter data sets and also airline traffic between different airports.
Wow.
We represented this very coarse representation, but reasonably good for something like a national scale spread.
Okay.
And then we looked at, for the past few seasons, we fit this model using historical data. And once we have a model that reasonably represents how influenza spreads, we can ask the question, let's take the current policies, what they do, population proportional assignment. And if you do that, you're doing this almost uniformly across the states. And that has one level of control of the influenza virus.
Okay.
Total number of infections.
Right.
What we asked was, since there is a very clear spatial spread, can we use the current spatial information where influenza is taking off and use that to inform where should we ramp up vaccination? And there's a whole another aspect of whether this is reasonable, because what you're asking is the northern states, even though they might have people who are ready for influenza vaccine, you're saying you don't have to worry for now. We have limited resources. We are going to give it to the southern states because they need it right now, and you can wait for 2 2 weeks. And so there's a lot of these ethical kind of questions that we have to address. And the first question was, before we even consider those things, how to address those, we have to first figure out whether it helps.
Right.
It's almost like if you're trying to, taking the forest fire analogy, if a forest fire starts in a particular region and then it goes to the forest, then do you pour water all around and make sure that all the trees are wet so they don't catch fire? Or do you pour most of your water near the fire and just stop it right at the source? And you have to do both to some extent.
Right.
But how do you balance them? And that's the kind of question that we asked here.
Wow. This would also mean, if you're using network theory and network science, it would also mean how do you do this most effectively if there are certain super spreaders or at the risk of certain category of people being super spreaders, then perhaps the maximum impact comes from immunizing there, right? So because there is an idea of herd immunity also involved. I mean, when we're talking about even our old SIR models, one level of building complexity is to say what happens if there are vaccinated people who are just barriers to the crossing of a particular disease.
Yeah. So we've done similar work even in the network context. I can send you some of these references. The solution that we come up with is again inspired from something that we see in networks, which is called ring vaccination, where if you see someone infected, find their contacts and vaccinate them, or find their contacts of contacts because maybe their contacts are already exposed,
right,
or whereas their contacts of contacts might still be susceptible. So you vaccinate them and you kind of build a ring around the infected population. And the faster you can build that, you can control the disease spread. And so the same kind of questions apply both in this general everyone mixes with everyone world. And there's a really nice simulation in Washington Post. I don't know if you've seen that, where they look at almost like a billiard ball kind of a model and have these different knobs to control the rates at which balls are moving around and people social distancing and show like how the epi curve or epidemic curve gets flattened.
That was a fantastic set of illustrations and models, and they really simplified the science to a great deal. And I think there's a reason why flatten the curve has become a phrase that has now been translated across languages. It's become a meme unto itself, and everyone's talking about it. It's become such a powerful idea that was also, I think, communicated very powerfully by a lot of people. So now coming to COVID then. This is a brand new disease. This is a coronavirus which is novel in how it affects both the upper and lower respiratory systems. It's different from SARS in that it is perhaps more infectious. At the same time, it's quite deadly. It's this brand new beast. So apart from the work that you're doing, you and your colleagues are doing at the Biocomplexity Institute, what kind of modeling efforts have you come across so far? I think just before we spoke, I shared a preliminary model that a few scholars at the University of Michigan had come up with for India, where they'd used a modified SIR model, compartment model of some sort. We've seen the Imperial College of London putting out a bunch of reports on how the disease might affect England and other places. Generally, what is the sense that you're getting so far with how modeling is proceeding across the world?
I think what we've seen is like unprecedented level of global collaboration and also like the rapidity with which scientists and epidemiologists have approached this disease is really heartening to see. And we're seeing this emergence of preprints, which are, because of the journal publication process, it takes longer for results to get out. So people have started publishing all of these on preprints to share results. And there are a lot of these collaborative efforts happening across multiple universities. And the questions that they ask across countries are very similar in the sense that first, there are a set of questions about what are the epidemic parameters of this disease. Any model that we use, like be it agent-based or compartmental, we need to know some things very basic about the disease. Like, for instance, R0 is one thing. And then what fraction of people are symptomatic? What is the case fatality rate? And then how long is the infectious period? And these are numbers that you can estimate based on patient data. We had like from Chinese universities, especially studying the Wuhan and Hubei province outbreaks, they did a fantastic job of like, we had papers which said like the first 40 patients and then first 144 patients and then first 7,000 patients and first 40,000 patients. And you got these very clear signs of like, they were trying to share as many characteristics and like data points as possible for the global community to look at it and make estimates. And they also shared within a first week of announcing that they had cases, they shared the entire genome profile, made it publicly available. And that has triggered off a lot of research on building these diagnostic kits, because unless you know the exact genome, then it's very tough to detect it. It's almost like the mugshot that you need before you let your detectives and police out there. I think like those efforts are the first thing that starts off, like just understanding the disease, the basic parameters of the disease. And then the second set of questions that are happening is around the spread. And the first is spread globally. So we did some work on that. And the question was, since until like end of January, it was mainly China and a couple of other Southeast Asian countries that had cases. And we had started seeing emergence in like US, and like the first cases arrived in Washington in like Jan 21st. And we did see some cases coming up in Europe. The general question was, when will it reach these different countries? And that's a very early phase kind of a question. And we did some modeling using international airline data to predict like emergence times, like times of arrival.
Okay.
And then we used the data on like airline restrictions to see whether that buys us time. Like usually, again, this is another thing that we have seen in an unprecedented manner for this pandemic, where airlines are canceling and like countries are putting travel advisories and canceling all incoming flights, a lot of screening happening.
Right.
And we wanted to see like how much time does it buy.
Okay.
There's one kind of analysis along those lines. Then comes the next phase where you're looking at, once it comes inside a country, how will it spread? Once you have early cases in a country, it no longer matters whether it's almost like once a forest fire takes off in a particular section of the forest,
right,
doesn't matter if like new sparks are thrown into it.
Okay.
So it's almost like that. So we wanted to study like once it reaches countries like Italy or South Korea or Germany, how does it spread locally? And how does the testing aspect and testing, case isolation, and all the interventions that people are doing on the ground and how people are changing their behavior, how does it change course? Like, can we explain why South Korea was able to bend the curve reasonably quickly, and how China is not having enough? So China is now predominantly like imported cases. They reported like 46 new cases yesterday, which is a very small number compared to where they were like almost a month back. And so they were, and of the 46, it's 45 are imported cases. Same way, like you can see Singapore and Hong Kong having similar situations. So they were able to control it by different means. So just explaining them, understanding what's happening. And a simple question, I think you might have seen these analysis where just what they call like method of analogs, where you take US and then just align them in time of starting with, say, Italy or UK or China, and then see like how far behind. Like, because all of these are exponentials, with appropriate scaling for population size and density, and aligning them in time, you would start seeing like these countries are very similar. We are just 11 days behind where Italy was, and UK is just 14 days behind what Italy is doing right now. And that gives a really shocking way of looking at, we shouldn't be delaying what you're doing. Like, this is the time in Italy's epidemic that they closed everything down, and they still have this many deaths 10 days later. And we are still going as business as usual. Then we should we should have done something about it sometime back. And so those are really powerful messages that come out of very simple analysis. And finally, the kind of model that come out is what is the impact of these different interventions? Like, once you understand for some of these countries where interventions have worked, project it forward by doing like, let's look at the social distancing that most of the people in US or India are doing. Let's look at better testing capabilities. What are the impacts of that? How will it impact? And this entire phenomenon of flatten the curve was about, if this is a novel disease and most of us are susceptible, it will eventually spread to the population until there is this concept of herd immunity. So the question is, do you want that happening over the next 2 months, or do you want to kind of stretch it out so that you're still allowing the hospital healthcare system to be able to operate reasonably within their capacity? Because what you're seeing in countries like Italy is, once it crosses that capacity, you have to make very tough decisions of whom to triage. Because if you have 100 beds and 3,000 people come at your doorstep, you have to decide which 100 you serve, and different disparities get amplified.
And that's an ugly question to try and answer, right? I mean, there are no good answers to that question. There is no optimal answer to such a question.
What you say is like the optimal answer, even if you try to define an optimal answer, your bias comes through the objective that you're trying to maximize. So you will... Yeah.
Definitely. And that goes into the realm of ethics rather than pure optimization, right?
Yes. I mean, you can always optimize, but like you don't want that kind of a situation. Basically, you don't want to end up in a situation where you have to make those decisions.
One can argue that even eugenics is one form of optimization on a very different thing, right? But that's not something you want to be optimizing the public sort of gene distribution on. And similarly over here.
Exactly. And again, where the decisions have to be made at, you want to ensure some kind of uniformity of decisions, but also different countries might make different decisions. And basically what this flatten the curve says is like, let's not get to that point. And sadly, we are seeing that a lot of countries are approaching that point, or almost. And again, this is something that we have to be mindful of, because in a normal peacetime society, or in a normal operating society, you don't need one bed for every person, one ICU bed for every person in the population.
Right.
If you have 12 million people in Bangalore, say 60% of them have cars, you don't need roads to operate all the 60%, all the 7 million cars on the road at the same time. So it's most of our systems are built with some estimate of normal operating capacity and maybe some slack on top of it, 10 to 20%, sometimes 100%, double the capacity for emergency. But once you have something like a pandemic sweeping through a population, you will hit that capacity eventually. The question is, how long do you want to be under that, under that deficit mode, or how many people do you want to triage? And that's a very tough trade-off to make, because if your hospital system is stressed for almost 2 years, operating near 100% capacity, which already are, some of the hospitals might already be at 90 to 95% capacity even without any of the COVID-19 cases.
Indeed. I mean, many stories that are coming out of India right now from many hospitals, some of this is anecdotes, some of this is reportages, that we do have H1N1, swine flu, other things, and this March is the season for a lot of allergens and so many different sort of causes where there are many, many people who are already in hospitals and in ICUs with severe acute sort of respiratory infections, and the big unknowns that troubles me is in India, sometimes there is so much quote unquote noise, right? Because there are so many different infections that are there in the ecosystem. So sometimes finding the signal for something like COVID within that larger pool might also be a much more difficult challenge compared to, say, the same in the United States or elsewhere. For example, this was just an analogy that a friend of mine was sharing who studied medicine and practices today. He was saying that abroad, you can get an MD in infectious diseases. In India, infectious diseases becomes a part of the core curriculum of internal medicine. So if you do an MD in internal medicine, you're actually spending most of your time, or at least half of your time, looking at infectious diseases. And so that's our sort of local reality here back in India. I think we'll have to figure out how to both devise the right kind of models, ask the right kind of questions of these models, and try to take action based on those insights that are fundamentally relevant and important to India.
You've used the phrase that communication engineers and electrical engineers use very often in our understanding of wireless net, what we call a signal to noise ratio. And if you have the noise floor to be very high, it's very tough to detect the signal. From your earlier podcast, I heard that 50% of the people who come in have some sense of influenza-like symptoms. Then you have to make decisions of whom to test it. Right now, things are coming out from Italy where if you try to isolate every single COVID-19 patient and give them hospital beds, you may not have beds for the people who are really sick. But how do you know who's going to get really sick that early in this process? So it's that trade-off that it's very tough to make. And even now, even the testing capacity is limited. So states like Washington and New York are trying to prioritize testing for healthcare workers and nurses who are getting exposed more, because you want them, they're the frontline soldiers right now. And you need to make sure that they are not infected. All these models allow us to play out different scenarios. You can think of them as sandboxes where if you want to think of different policies, you have to take these models with a giant bag of salt. But the models are still very useful because they allow you to encode these assumptions Because what we actually operate with are also models of the world. Like in our mind, we have models of the world, what we call mental models. We don't have them written as equations or written as computer code, but we know that like if we throw a ball at the wall at some pace, we know that in some time it's going to come back to us at some particular velocity, at some height. And we don't do ordinary differential equations in our head. We have just trained ourselves. So we know where to duck or where to catch. The same way, when you look at social system, that intuition is tough because you're dealing with a complex system, which cannot be just written down or like learned by interacting with it. Like these kind of pandemics come once in a century. So you don't get enough training. You don't have ways to encode that lessons also. Right? That's what models allow you to do. Learn the lessons, encode them, transfer them, preserve them. Yeah, in some sense.
Absolutely. And I think that's the big challenge, right? How does a world or even a country or any institution deal with events that are truly of a very low frequency but a very high impact? And I think all of us need to figure out how to do it, because things that happen repeatedly, we can learn and adapt and do better next year. But things that come once in a while, how much resources do you allocate to this, or how many procedures do you figure out ahead of time in anticipation for an event that may not even come for the next 20 years. So I think it is a big, big challenge. And I love that epidemiological modeling is become such an important science during this time. And what I love in all of this, like what you mentioned with the graphics that Washington Post and others put out, is that modeling has not just helped inform decision makers, but have also been powerful in informing and shaping public narratives. And I think that's fantastic. I think there is very rare that any subset of science is able to do both simultaneously. And I'm glad that that's happening right now with COVID-19.
Yeah, models allow you to actually capture what is not very intuitive, because humans are very bad at thinking exponentially. Humans are very bad at thinking probabilistically. Humans are very bad at thinking complex systems. We have to understand some of the limitations that we are working with. I'm not saying like we don't make probabilistic decisions. There are people, gamblers, who really understand probability much better than people who are studying probability. And there are people who actually know social complex systems, like for instance, the stock market, like the back of their hand. But it's something that we don't understand at every individual level. And also when you're making policy decisions, we don't know the cascading effects. Like right now, we can put all our efforts into stopping this virus, and that should be a top priority. But governments are also thinking about what would be the downstream impacts, and should we prepare for that? And how much do we reserve for that? That's a tough question to answer. It is an interesting challenge, but it needs to be solved as we go through it, rather than try to wait for like a good solution. Our collective responsibility is to convey the uncertainty in a reasonable fashion and still be able to give concrete information for decision making and like action. Because if you say that we don't know anything, it doesn't inspire confidence. But if you say we are very sure you must be doing this, that doesn't convey the uncertainty of the system.
In general, modeling the world around us seems to be a challenge pretty much in every sphere. And today we are talking about it in the context of epidemiology and diseases. And thank you so much for shedding so much light on this field, which is a black box to most of us. Srini, thank you so much again for joining us on the Pragati Podcast.
This was a pleasure. And the bottom line is, again, when the present determines the future, but the approximate present does not approximately determine the future. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. And when you see like mixed messages coming out, we should appreciate the complexity that all these governments and public health agencies are dealing with.
Thank you so much, Srini. Stay safe. And thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Pavan, and take care.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Paisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.